Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Changing Room podcast. My name is Arbela and I am your host. Thank you so much for being here again for another amazing episode. Today is an actually very special episode because it is our first guest who is an out-of-towner. So up till now, we've had Cleveland-based guests. This is our first virtual episode, and it's with the one and only Emily Stochel of Pre-Loved Podcast. You may know Emily from her podcast, where she talks to different people from the world and realms of vintage, styling, secondhand fashion. She publishes episodes every week, and I was actually on one of her episodes a couple weeks back. So I'm very excited to have her on as my kind of first out-of-town guest, and this discussion was truly amazing in every way. Emily has a wealth of experience in the world of secondhand fashion, but also sustainability, and with her work with Remake, which is a nonprofit organization that is an advocate for sustainability in the fashion world. Without further ado, here is our episode. I think you will absolutely enjoy it, and be sure to check out the Changing Room podcast through the links in the description. And thanks for being here. Hi, Emily. I am so excited for you to be on the podcast today. Welcome to the Changing Room. This is a very special episode because you are my first non-local guest, my first out-of-town guest, and I honestly cannot think of a better first for that, because you and I already met in New York, and you and I both have, love talking about all things fashion, all things secondhand, on both of our podcasts. So this has just worked out so perfectly. And before we jump into it, I just want to make sure everyone knows I also was on Emily's podcast that came out several weeks ago now. It comes out every week and on Mondays. So be sure to check that out. But yeah, we're doing this audio only, but you still need to answer my first question for every guest, which is, what is your outfit right now? And is there a story behind it?
Amazing. I will paint a picture for everybody.
Yes, please do.
So it always has a story, right? Like, that's just the way it is with me. I'm a big outerwear girl. I love a blazer, a jacket, a coat, and I live in a cold place. I live in Iowa. So I have a good excuse to wear a lot of coats and own a lot of vintage coats. So today I'm wearing one of my favorite leather blazers in my collection, and it's patchwork leather, like one of those colorful patchwork leather jackets that look like the rainbow fish scales. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes, I know exactly. I'm imagining it in my head. I know exactly what you're talking about.
So basically the story behind this piece is, last fall, I was in New York. I was covering the Manhattan Vintage Show, which is this incredible vintage show that happens 3 times a year in Manhattan. And dealers from collectors, trend forecasters, designers, like all the fashion people from all really around the world come to New York for this show. And I was doing a piece on the show for Refinery 29. So I got to interview a bunch of vintage dealers about what was popular with their shoppers that season and all that good stuff. And I don't think these coats were something that they particularly named, but because I had like my eyes out for things like that, I spotted this as just an item that I kept noticing in vendors' booths, and I was really drawn to. And we talked about a lot of other hot items, but I kept noticing these leather jackets, and they're kind of a special piece, so the price point can be a little high, and I wanted to find the right one and the right size and everything. So I didn't end up getting one that day, but I kept noticing them as I would go booth to booth. And I mean, this show, if you haven't checked it out, like, it is worth a trip to see. It's like vintage Disneyland. There's like hundreds of sellers there, and just unbelievable things you've never seen before in your life. And so then after the show, I come back home, and a few weeks later, Harry Styles came out with that Gucci Ha 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 collection.
Yeah.
And imagery from this collection was so vintage inspired, like very 70s retro, up my alley. And there were like corduroy and denim suits and pointy lapels. And then they had one of these fish scale leather jackets, and it was running $8,500 for the Gucci
Oh my
version.
God. Yep, sounds about right.
Yeah, and I was like, I'm gonna find a vintage one. And so then I became like kind of obsessed with hunting. And then right around that same time, Taylor Swift released her anti-hero music video. And in general, like that era, Midnight's era, had like a lot of 70s inspired fashion in it. And in the music video, there's this dinner party scene where all the friends are sitting around and one is wearing a leather fish scale jacket. So I was like, I'm gonna find it. So every year, my very kind mother-in-law does this lovely thing where she lets me pick out a vintage piece for myself and then order it to her house, and she wraps it up for me for Christmas. And it's like the perfect mother-in-law gifting thing, because I know that I can be a little like hard to shop for as like a person who mostly loves vintage. And then she gets to be like surprised by whatever I open, and I get to tell her like why I picked it out and why it's meaningful to me and things like that. So anyway, I found one of these jackets. It's a vintage 1970s leather patchwork jacket. The tag says the Tannery and made in Korea. And I knew it was going to be the right fit because I asked the vintage seller for all of these little particular measurements. Like when I'm ordering something online, I take out a measuring tape and I measure a jacket that I already have and like the fit of, and I measure things like the shoulder, like the arm opening, all these kinds of things, and compare it to my jacket sample so I can feel confident ordering online and knowing it would fit. So long story short, that's my jacket.
I love it. I love it. I love there's a whole journey that brought this jacket to you. And I think that is like a lot. That definitely reflects how I shop for a lot of pieces too. Like I maybe find an inspiration for something, and then I can't maybe buy that piece I'm looking for whatever reason. But then it somehow like makes its way to you, especially if you're looking for it, and you looked for it, it seems. So that is amazing.
I did. And I've got a few, my whole outfits like always have a story. So it opens a total can of worms to ask me about anything. But
I love it.
My t-shirt that I'm wearing is a vintage t-shirt. So I grew up in St. Louis, and in St. Louis, the classic rock radio station is called KSHE. And in the 70s, KSHE Rock Radio, their logo is like, I don't know if it's like a dog or a pig or something. I'll have to send you a photo. It's some sort of animal wearing headphones. But in the 70s, the dog is smoking a joint in the logo. And so it's like kind of like a niche St. Louis like vintage thing that one of my favorite vintage sellers in St. Louis, Black Rabbit Vintage, she's actually been on my show as well. She got one in, and I was like, oh, I have to have that for my collection.
Yeah.
And then my pants are my dead stock Stan Ray painter pants that I got at the Consistency Project in New York. I don't know if I told you about them when we were together, but This is my absolute like favorite place to buy vintage pants because they do a fitting service.
Yes, I remember. Good. That is so genius. Like about with the fitting, like I think that is just so important. I love that.
It is. It's like a huge pain point in the vintage industry. And so basically you go in and you book an appointment. It's just you there, and they take all your measurements for you. And then you tell them kinds of things you're looking for, whether it's carpenter pants or denim and light wash, dark wash colors. And they just pull things that will fit you, and then you try it on. And then if you want to purchase something, you can purchase it and they will tailor it for you. So I usually have to I have like curve your hips to waist ratio, so usually I have to fit to my hips and then have the waist kind of pinned in. I think that's like a pretty common problem for a lot of women. And I usually need to have things hemmed as well. And so they'll do that like with the purchase. So it's like my favorite place to buy secondhand pants. And I try to go like once a year at least when I'm in New York.
I love that, especially with pants. I feel like,
right.
It can be such a headache. I think that's like an amazing service. And Well, I'm going to actually jump to a question that kind of transitions us from what you were just chatting about. I would love to hear about more of your just kind of either shopping pearls of wisdom, like secondhand shopping pearls of wisdom habits that you would say are kind of in your toolkit. Because I've been thinking a lot about kind of like conscious shopping and how that applies to both secondhand shopping, but also, new shopping, whatever. And I've been kind of figuring out how I am just kind of reckoning with my own shopping habits, both good and bad. So I would love to hear, like, what are your own, like, rules, tips, wisdom when it comes to adding things to your wardrobe and building your wardrobe?
Ooh, I love this question. So I do obviously talk a lot about conscious shopping and sustainable shopping. On my page, I feel like you do too, just like thinking about these things and being thoughtful in the decisions that we make. And that being said, like, I will say I still have a lot of clothes. Like, I love clothes and I find a lot of joy in it. And I'm a little bit of a collector. And so like, I do have more clothes than I need. But a few things that I utilize that have worked really well for me to just keep my shopping habits thoughtful. I'm a big advocate of the thrift list. So I have the list on my phone of what I'm looking for. And I usually try to get pretty specific on there. So I don't just put like leather blazer. I'll put like red leather blazer with lapels or something like that. And usually that's informed by like all the things I'm saving from social media, whatever, all the inspiration images. And then when I go into the thrift store and I'm doing my search, I let myself just like pull things that I'm attracted to and put it in the cart and try it on and whatever. But when it comes to buying, if it wasn't a premeditated item on the thrift list that I wanted outside of the wonderland of the thrift store, then I have to really, really be able to justify that piece in order to purchase it. Because I think it's so easy to get swept up in the find, and we all do it and we've all done it. And so that helps like keep me honest with myself. And then the other thing is that I'm a very sentimental person. I have a Cancer sun. I'm obsessed with vintage. Like, I'm a sentimental person, and I like to have all of my pieces represent something. Like, even that whole intro I gave you, like, there's a thing about everything, that I bring into my closet. And I like that. I want to find the one piece that fits whatever hole in my closet I'm trying to fill, or the one piece to represent a trip that I took, or something to represent a certain memory. And keeping myself limited in that way means that I'm really determined to look for the very best that I can find. I like variety in my closet, but I just want to have like I want like the best black leather jacket I can find. I don't want like a whole rack of them, So whatever item I'm picking up has to be an absolute hell yes. And I have to love it enough to be like, now I don't need to search for this anymore. This is mine.
Yeah. And that quality over quantity approach, I think, is just it's so simple, but it can be hard to put into practice with just how much we are like bombarded with like trends and ads and, oh my gosh, just like, I don't know, just think about holiday sales coming up and stuff. And there's sales across every type of shopping, not just new shopping, also secondhand shopping. And one thing for myself that I've been trying my best to work on is really, like, honestly, figuring out which environments, like shopping environments, invite the most impulse shopping. So for me, unfortunately, heartbreakingly, it is thrift stores often because they have the cheapest prices somewhat. I mean, not all of them, let's be honest, the prices are going up, but it's also like usually a little bit of a larger space. I get overstimulated. I get very disorganized in my head. So the thrift list is like definitely something I try to utilize as well. Just kind of like, and I like how you said you just are really specific about it, because I think you have to be strict with yourself to a certain point. I mean, but also finding that balance of like, I mean, sometimes I just see something and I'm like swooned by it. I'm just like, I didn't think I needed this, but it's just speaking to me. So yeah, I like that. I like that it's kind of like it has to be a hell yes. Definitely good wisdom.
Right? Like, but sometimes you do just get overpowered by how cool something is. But I think the other thing that I've let myself realize is that you there's like so much out there that you're always going to find what you're looking for. That's what I tell myself. And so if I'm not convinced that it's the one, like I'm okay to keep looking until I
Yeah.
find the one.
Yeah, because it sounds like for you, and I can definitely relate to this too, but the journey of the search is like part of the fun
Oh, it's
too.
absolutely part of the fun.
It
People are
is.
like, oh, it takes too long. And I'm like, but isn't it so great when you find what you have been looking for? That
Yeah.
reward?
And building that patience and that just kind of love for like that journey, maybe that is also a key to like being sustainable. Another thing I've been trying to do too is just if I see something beautiful and just something really cool, but there's just those couple, what's the word? Just like hiccups that I'm like, I know I'm not going to wear it because of A, B, or C. Oh, but it's so pretty. It's so cool. It's so cool. I just let myself like take a photo and just like bask in the beauty of it and just like, it's like, okay, that is just like a pretty thing I can admire and I can just like remember and it can inspire future purchases maybe, and it can be a part of my taste, but I don't have to always own it. I think there's such a speed and a rush and like an urgency to own everything. And I think, yeah, patience. You seem to have just so much patience with like the journey. And I think more people should adopt that. I love that.
Maybe I'm learning. I feel like travel has really like helped me form that because I've had the privilege to travel a lot in my time, and sometimes I've done like backpacker travel, like where I just have a backpack and you cannot take it all with you. And so that just teaches you, I think, about that. And you come to enjoy going to vintage shops like you enjoy going to a museum. I always say, like, you know, I can just go and I can enjoy it. And like you said, take mental notes, take photos, have it seep into my life. But I don't have to, I can't buy the art off the wall. And that's okay.
That's okay. Absolutely. And I guess on that topic, sort of, we're talking a little bit about, you know, bringing stuff in. I also want to talk about bringing stuff out because I read this article you wrote about conscious decluttering, which was so interesting to me because it was during 2020, which it was a very interesting like context for that because I think a lot of people were like, you know, stuck in their homes, thinking about their own wardrobes, thinking about cleaning things out. And the idea of like consciously removing things from your wardrobe is something that has caught, I don't know, I've been thinking about more and more in the last couple years. Because I think we often think about, you know, okay, like getting rid of clothes, it's a good thing. You know, okay, we get a big garbage bag and we're giving it away and hooray. But I've been trying to be more mindful about it. And I think going back to the theme of like patience, like sometimes there are things like maybe I don't wear for a couple years, but then I come back to and I'm like, oh, I'm going to like rotate this back into my wardrobe. And at the end of the day, I mean, they say that like the most sustainable thing to buy, quote unquote, is just the thing in your wardrobe. But anyway, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about that. What did you learn from just like writing that article, or any like just kind of ideas you may have around how can we consciously clean out our closets without like causing more issues from a sustainable sense, but also for our own personal style development?
Yeah, absolutely. So this, I would say, has been one of my greatest unlearnings about working in the secondhand industry for the last, 8 years or so. And it came about because, 2020, think about we're all at home, people are decluttering. Also, the Marie Kondo Netflix show had come out fairly recently. And so people were really decluttering like mad. And I was starting to see all these headlines about, I remember seeing headlines from ThreadUp about how their closet clean out kits, like they'd never had such a surge for them before. I remember seeing articles from local Goodwills about how people were just, obviously no one was working in the Goodwill, no one was sorting in the very early days of the pandemic, and people were just piling up trash outside of, I mean, they in the giver's mind, it wasn't trash, like it was things that they wanted to donate. But in a lot of senses, like if we're really honest with ourselves, like a lot of people do just fill a trash bag with things that they otherwise don't care about or don't know what to do with, and take it to the thrift store. And I think that we do have to be really honest with ourselves, because we've been taught that taking things to the thrift store is a charity. And the reality is that a lot of thrift shops, they, yes, utilize the clothes that are coming to them to fund a charity initiative. So selling the clothes is what they use to make money to support whatever charitable good they're doing, whether it's for an animal shelter or medical research or job training or whatever. And so it is good to support those things, but you need to look at the item that you're taking to the thrift store and think, is someone going to reasonably be able to sell this item in order to make money to fund whatever charitable mission? Can you hear me still? Okay, I thought you dropped for a second. Can you hear me?
Oh, okay, no, you're awesome. Good. Yes.
So
I did hear a little like lapse.
A drop, yeah. Okay.
But I can still hear you. Okay, continue.
You need to look at those items and say, like, is somebody reasonably going to be able to sell this to make money for a charitable initiative? Because I think that we've been taught that the reason that we're taking things to charity shops is because someone who is in more need than us will need the item. And while sometimes charity shops do serve that function, it really isn't their primary function. And to be honest, there's so much stuff in this world that people don't really need things that are in bad shape, you know? And I think that oftentimes, you know, we just think, well, someone will make use of this. And it's like, well, if it's not useful to you or anyone in your family, like, why would you necessarily think that anybody in your community would be able to make use of that? So just, again, being thoughtful about it. It's a complex system. The fashion industry has sped up so much. We are making so much clothing at so much poorer and poorer quality that thrift stores are really not able to make use of all of the items that come through them. Only about 10 to 20% of the clothing donated to thrift stores here in the US actually resells domestically. The vast majority of pieces get sold on to wholesalers, and it kind of moves throughout this secondhand supply chain. There's textile recyclers, wholesalers, balers, shredders that break it down into things like insulation. There's exporters who then send bales of garments overseas, typically to countries in the global south, and then resellers there purchase it and attempt to resell it. But because of the sheer volume, like just to give people an example, the largest secondhand market in Africa is Kantamanto Market in Accra, Ghana, and 15 million garments flow through there every week. But there's only 5 million people living in Accra, Ghana. So 3 items per week per person, right?
Yeah.
And it's so much, and it's poor quality. And so the reality is that people in these communities do their best to resell it, but ultimately about 40% of the clothing that arrives in port there ends up in landfill or informal waste site in those countries. And so I think it's just recontextualizing for people that there is so much used clothing in the market. Like we, you know, sometimes can have a scarcity mindset about consumer goods. And so we think like someone needs this or there's a need for it, or, you know, but there is so much, and it's unfortunately of lower quality than it used to be. And so I think just being thoughtful, looking at the item, saying, would I want to give this to a friend before you donate it to a secondhand store? And people will often ask me like, oh, if I shouldn't donate stuff, then what should I do with it instead? And it's not that you shouldn't donate anything. Like, that's not what I'm saying. But just flip the question back on its head and really think about where you want this garment to end up. And also realize that I don't have a perfect answer for that question, because sometimes people will say, okay, well, you're telling me I shouldn't give my ripped up holy t-shirt to the charity shop because no one's going to want it, but what should I do it instead? And it's like, well, I don't have a perfect answer for you, because there's no perfect green trash can that will make that item disappear. And so I think we also, if we can get there, it would be good to push ourselves to think about taking responsibility for those items that we went out and bought in the first place. And maybe if we did that, we would buy less in the first place because we're taking responsibility for it. Maybe we'd get more creative in our reuse strategies. You know, can you cut up that thing and use it as a rag? Can you use it as a dog toy? Can you find some use for it? Could we take better care of our things so that they don't get into that shape, or they can be mended? And sometimes the answer is no. Like, sometimes there's nothing that we can do with it. But I think just realizing that there is no perfect where do we go with it solution, and trying to push ourselves to be a little bit more resourceful in the system that we live in, and seeing where that would leave us. And this is really not intended to be a criticism of people who are still processing this. It's just a reframing, because this has been one of, like I said, one of my greatest unlearnings of being a thrift shopper and researching this space and kind of realizing some of these complexities about the secondhand system. So I hope that posing some of these questions will help other people just continue to be more thoughtful about it.
Absolutely. And I think those are such important questions because, again, as you said, like, it is interesting how, donating to the thrift store has been framed as this, like, okay, well, that's just like the solution. But it's really good to know kind of how these actions kind of connect to this like greater, bigger picture of like clothing waste. And yeah,
I think about it, like a charity shop is, like I said, like they're supposed to be able to use the items in the shop to sell them, to make money, to support a cause. They're not supposed to be our global municipal recycling and trash solution. And they're not funded by government infrastructure funding, and they're not, they're just not equipped to handle all of the world's waste. And somewhere along the lines, it seems like we fell into heading that direction and just like thinking about what is the purpose that they serve in the community.
Oh, that's so true. Yeah. And I think what you mentioned, the thing you mentioned about creative solutions, I think is also like, if someone is like feeling kind of frustrated, like, oh, well, whatever I do isn't right. Like, and I can definitely empathize with that. But also like, there are like, I think it is just about recontextualizing and not thinking like, okay, I put all of this away and that's the one solution. And I've been thinking about this also more about how just like clothing connects with like our community. I got to organize a clothing swap late last year or early this year, February, and it was really amazing. And it was just, another chance to kind of like connect with, people and think about like, okay, maybe this can be an option before we consider the thrift store. Maybe, and oh my gosh, the point you made about taking care of your clothes, mending your clothes, I think they're all like having that sort of intentional philosophy about our clothing, I think could also really create a change in, sustainability in general. So yeah, there isn't a clear answer, but I think asking these questions already kind of will help instead of just, so I think that's...
And I love that you brought up community solutions, because I think that's great. Clothing swaps are great. There are some really cool young artists in my community, and I live in a small community in Iowa, and there are some really cool young artists who are upcyclers, and they want to take pieces and block print on them and do patchwork and things on them, and and so like there are solutions, and sometimes you do just need to like ask around in your community. And again, it goes back to, I think, what I was talking about when I was talking about secondhand shopping. Like, people are like, oh, that's a lot of effort. Well, and then maybe we do just kind of slow down on how much how much are you really having to like get rid of? And
Yeah.
does that bear reflecting on? And, maybe we just like want to recontextualize it in a way that we don't feel overburdened by like, how much you can connect with community and share
Mm-hmm.
resources. And,
Mm-hmm.
um,
Yeah.
yeah, it's not about trying to be perfect, but it's just about the mindset shift that I think is a part
Yeah.
of going on this whole journey.
Yeah. I mean, I just always think about like just I mean from just like almost a poetic perspective, like clothing really is like that is the closest to our bodies, and it's
Mm-hmm.
just like this thing that is very close to us, and it's become like the industry has become bloated and huge and further away from us, which is just I think goes against what, I don't know, clothing and getting dressed should be all about. Like we should be zooming in, getting closer, tightening up, kind of inviting that community aspect. A recent friend of mine who was on the podcast too, Olivia, she co-owns a Shop Slow Union, which is a vintage store, one that you definitely need to check out as soon as you come to Cleveland.
Yeah.
They've been hosting like embroidery workshops and stuff like that, where like, if you want an item that maybe you want, a little bit something extra, instead of going out and buying an item that's like embroidered, already, like you can come and bring it and get this customization. And it's a very tiny example, but it's one of those things where like, it's something in my community, and I look forward to whenever they have that, because I'm like, instead of buying a new item, I could just pick something I have and make it feel new, to kind of scratch that itch of like getting something. So yeah, overall, great advice. I love that. And I guess while we're on the discussion of just sustainable style, before we wrap it up, you work with Remake. So could you tell me a little bit about your time? Like, what is Remake for those of my listeners who don't know? What kind of work do you guys do, and kind of any other, sustainability wisdom you may want to add?
Absolutely. So, Remake is a really cool global fashion advocacy organization that is interested in remaking the fashion system from like a systems and policy change perspective. So, I've talked a little bit about some of those mindset shifts we can do as individuals, and I do think that they're important because the mindset shifts help us like get to a point where we want to make systemic change. But I think that another very, very crucial aspect to reshaping the fashion industry into something that does good in the world instead of harm in the world is policy change and regulation and advocating for brands to do better. So I've had the honor of working with Remake in one way or another for several years now, and working with them has really shaped my ideas about sustainable fashion change and how I think about it. I think back to 2018, which is when I first found Remake, and also when I first started Pre-Love podcast. And at that time, a lot of emphasis in the sustainable fashion space was being put on things like sustainable swaps, like switch this product for that product. And like low waste living and conscious fashion brands and things like that. And I was aware of the problems of the fashion industry, but I wasn't exactly, for whatever reason, resonating with those solutions that were presented. And I couldn't have explained why to you at the time. I think part of it was just I was already thrifting and dressing really vintage inspired. And the conscious fashion aesthetic at that time was very neutral and minimal. And I don't think that it's limited in those same ways now, but something
Mm-hmm.
back then, it just didn't click with me. And then I also had this background. My grandma, who was really involved in bringing me up, was a labor organizer at the plastic factory where she worked.
Wow.
And I would always hear these stories from her about participating in strikes and walkouts and organizing for better wages or safety practices through their union. And she had instilled in me this understanding of collective action. She was very passionate about voting and political campaigning, and she would work at the polling place every election and what it meant to
Mm.
change a system, not just to elevate your own way of being. And I
Mm.
think that all those things were in my head as I came to the sustainable fashion space. And Remake has really helped me to develop those ideas a lot. I think the sustainable fashion industry over the last couple of years has really shifted in that direction of systemic change. And I now feel much more connected to that work of trying to transform the fashion industry to create higher wages for garment workers and reduce the amount that we are producing. And this is on the industry. It's on the biggest brands. It's not just about us as a one person. It's about a collective we, but we can use our position in this world to advocate for that change to occur. So that's what Remake does. I run the Remake Ambassador Program, which is how change makers can get involved in our work. You can check it out online. It's a really cool program. We connect you to other fashion change makers and help tap you into campaigning work.
Awesome. I love that. Yeah, and it seems like I love how you mentioned this, like, especially like the stories you heard from your grandmother, because I think like it's so interesting how this has these kind of struggles tied to fair wages, and labor has been something that's, I don't know, it's still happening today in different ways. And I don't know, I think it's such a good thing how it's like we're approaching it through like a fashion and clothing perspective, because it really is like the decisions we make in our personal lives matter. But of course, I really like how you tied it back to like this collective action. That's so interesting. And then so you said you've been with Remake and pretty much as long as you've done the podcast, more or less.
Yeah. So I started the podcast in the fall of 2018. And then I think like early 19, one of my guests was Remake's wonderful founder, Aisha Baron-Blatt. And she invited me to sign up for what the ambassador program back then. And that's the program that I now help support. So
Amazing.
It's been a real full circle part of my journey, and doing that alongside Pre-Love Podcast, like I've really evolved all of my thoughts about sustainable fashion in both of those places, kind of in parallel.
Yes, I love that so much. And yeah, so you've been, doing the podcast for quite a while. I know it's really hard to pick favorite episodes. So I'm not going to ask that, but I am going to ask if there's any like big takeaways or just words of wisdom that, because I always learn things or just have these aha moments from my own guests or just like people that I interview for the newsletter. So any like kind of takeaways or words of wisdom that you've gotten from any of your guests through Pre-Love Podcast.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I learned something from every single one of my guests. And I've done this show for 5 years now. I've spoken to hundreds and hundreds of people. But I think my big takeaway is that vintage is a very human story. And so many people touch the vintage and secondhand fashion space in one way or another, and I learn from every one of them. And I think from the practical, like just the way that every aspect of the secondhand industry is truly done by hand, from sorting to cleaning to processing to dating and reselling clothing in markets and shops and thrift stores around the globe. There's thousands of people who are a part of this industry. And I just really enjoy getting to hear their stories. And that's the purpose of Pre-Love Podcast. I think that a lot of us, our engagement with the secondhand industry is maybe taking items from our closet to the thrift store in a trash bag, like we talked about, or it's just buying something, like just that exchange. It's a limited interaction, but this is really like a hugely interconnected human ecosystem. And going back to like what you and I have both said about community and those ties that bond us, I really romanticize that in the system. And I think that vintage clothing helps tell that story in a beautiful way, because there's all the people, but then there's the story of the item and who had this before and what was their life like. And I just want to help tell those stories and bring the people who are connected to those clothes into the focus for us.
Absolutely. Yes. And I think you definitely do that with just all the people you've chatted with. And yeah, I think adding that humanness to, our clothes, I mean, it's one of my favorite ways to talk about style and clothing, like just what, how other people interact with either their closets or even the items in that they're selling or anything like that. So it's truly amazing. Um, and another thing I wanted to ask, kind of going a little bit back to your own personal style. So you did live in New York at one point, and I don't know if you do a lot of traveling, and you said how traveling has impacted your style. Do you feel like your style has at all changed as you've like moved from place to place, or from just the travels you've had? Because I'm very curious, because I definitely feel a certain way about my travels and the different places I've lived and how it's impacted my style. So I'd love to hear your perspective.
Yeah, I think traveling has helped me shape my mindset around clothing a lot. Like I talked about, just having parameters around things can be really helpful. It also teaches you, if you're living out of a backpack, what things are durable, what things you can wear over and over and over again every couple of days. It's taught me, like I said, that approach to vintage shopping, like a museum going experience, and looking and admiring, but not always needing to buy something to take it home with me to have an enjoyable experience. I don't know, so I lived in New York in my early 20s, so my style has changed a lot, but I think it more so had to do with growing up than it did
Definitely.
the place that I lived. But I find inspiration everywhere. Like I'm just like constantly, and I know you're the same way. I'm just like constantly, I think it's the writers in us
Yeah.
observing people and things, and like, seeing something in a vintage shop can just send me on this rabbit hole of history and inspiration and aesthetic research. And yeah, I love nothing more.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's see. I also want, why not? I didn't think we'd have time for this question, but I do want to ask you, and again, this is such a hard thing to choose, but what are some of your kind of favorite vintage pieces in your closet, and ones that you would like never get rid of? Like these are like your ride or die items, like you are passing them down, like you are not giving them away ever. I just would love to hear any of items that are like near and dear to your heart.
Yeah, so a lot of the pieces that I bring into my collection have a story about a person, whether it's someone cool that I met when I was traveling, or a person who gave it to me, or my friend owned this and we swapped it and now it's mine. And those are the pieces that I'm most sentimental about. So one example is I have my dad's Letterman jacket from when he was in high school, and my dad passed away when I was 19. So it's
Oh.
really very meaningful to have this. And also, just the funny thing about it is my dad was a really big guy. Like he was a big guy. He was a football player, he was a linebacker. And somehow this Letterman jacket fits me. I don't know if he got it before he went through his growth spurt or whatever, but somehow it fits me really well. And I wear it often, and it's very meaningful. And then I also have my grandma's locket that she got from her union after 25 years of service. And it actually has my baby picture inside of it.
Hmm.
And she is very much like the heart of all of the labor rights activism that I do. And so having that and having that piece of her with me always is really important to me.
Yeah.
And yeah, those are the most sentimental pieces that I have. A couple pieces that I also really cherish. I have two French workwear jackets. I really love vintage workwear. And one I got from the Brooklyn Flea from a seller named Francois, who has been a Preload podcast guest. And I've had that for a little while now and really love it. I feel like it's very representative of my style. And then I just picked up one recently when I was in Amsterdam, and it's very different. The one is very long and it's like a bright, vivid cerulean blue. And then this one is shorter and it's already been worn a lot and it's faded very nicely. And I just know I'm going to have that piece, even though I only just got it. I know I'm going to have it forever because I can't wait to see how it ages with me. And I want to put my own stamp of wear on it.
Yes. Oh, that last line, that is exactly my favorite thing. Like how we leave our mark on our clothes. I mean, it's just the most exciting thing. And you reminded me about your trip to Amsterdam. So let's end with that. Please, what would you say was your biggest takeaway? So you did do some vintage shopping there. What was it like? What are your thoughts on the scene there, and just any other highlights you want to mention?
Yeah, so vintage shopping in Amsterdam is absolutely incredible. I loved it. I went to a lot of different shops and I've made some reels and content and stuff about that. But a couple of impressions. So something that I always love to do when I'm abroad is look for a piece that I feel is kind of representative of being there. And so that was why I decided to get a French workwear jacket while I was traveling there, because you can just find them a lot more in Europe than you can in the States. In the States, they're a lot more expensive as well. And so that was a really cool thing to find. I think my other big impression is that I know a lot of, and folks in the US do this too, but a lot of vintage dealers in Europe seem to work with importers, and they will import a lot of American vintage. So you see a lot of American pieces, whether it's vintage Levi's or cowboy boots or graphic tees from, places in the US. And I just always think that's a little funny when I'm traveling. I spotted even like a vintage T-shirt from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where I live.
Wow!
And
full circle.
Yeah, it's just funny to think about, and I think it's because, like I said, like a lot of them, I know when you do kind of wholesale, that's usually like a sort, like it might be like vintage graphic tee USA or something like that, and so I think that's why there is so much of it, but it's just very interesting to see. But I love to spot the things that you're not necessarily going to see in a vintage shop in the US, like made in Paris labels and things like that are really what get me excited.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, that is kind of funny. You go to Europe and you're like, oh, I want to find some like unique European fashion. It's like, oh, it's just a bunch of, American stuff. I can definitely relate to that visiting Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
There's even the store, even in like, definitely with like the new type stores, but there's literally like a store that's pretty much like for a copy of Forever 21. And I remember going to it back in like the 2010s and being like, well, it just feels like I'm home. But really, like, I always was able to find the most unique pieces either at like handmade markets, which I realized I didn't talk to you about at my during your episode, but that was also a big place to find really unique pieces, and pieces that were like Lithuania is very known for like their linen pieces, and you would just go to these markets and find these like amazing like pants or just shawls and stuff like that. So yeah, it is fun to go to these places and just be like, okay, how can I find the hidden gems? But that sounds so cool. Amsterdam is definitely on my list, and I will definitely be messaging you when I go.
I love giving vintage recommendations.
Yes, I love you. You truly have such like a you're gonna be like this, like you're gonna have like a global directory at a certain point. I know you have one already, right? You have like a list for like secondhand. Yes, I love that.
I have a list on my site about all the recommendations that I gather.
Yes.
But yeah, I know. I was laughing with one of my friends when I was in Amsterdam about how I think it'd be so fun to have like a vintage themed travel show. Because you can really see, there's so many like food themed travel shows, but I think that you can see the world through clothing just similarly to how you can see it through food.
Oh, that would be incredible.
Kind of universe. So.
Yes. Oh, like Anthony Bourdain, but
right, exactly.
with vintage clothes. Oh,
you see the vision.
Oh, absolutely. I'm surprised that doesn't exist. Maybe it does, but on a larger scale, we need that. We need that. All right. Well, Emily, thank you so much for being here with me. This has been such an amazing discussion. You just have so many incredible insights about the world of like style and sustainability. And I feel like I've learned so much just from chatting with you. So I really thank you so much for giving me your time and being here. So I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. I feel like you and I could chat about these things for days. It's really such a pleasure.
Yeah. And yeah, I will link everything in the description. But if is there anything else you want to just shout out on your end of like just content, anything's coming up you want to just promote? Just anything you want to mention?
Amazing. Yeah, come find me. I'm Emily Stochl across social media and Pre-Love Podcast, wherever you get your shows.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. I hope you have a good one.